What if the secret to running a successful business wasn't in the numbers, the spreadsheets, or even the profit margins, but in the way you treated the people who worked for you? That's exactly what James Callahan realized, and it changed everything. It was just another afternoon, ordinary and unremarkable, inside a bustling grocery store in Austin, Texas. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cool, artificial glow over the neatly arranged aisles. The air carried the familiar blend of scents: freshly baked bread, citrus from the produce section, and the faint trace of floor cleaner. Shopping carts rattled along the polished tile floors, sneakers squeaked as customers browsed the shelves, and snippets of conversations merged into a distant hum. To most, it was just another day in retail. But for James Callahan, this was more than just a store. It was a chance to see his business from the ground up. James wasn't just any customer. He was the owner of Callahan's Market, a fast-growing chain of supermarkets across Texas. But today, there were no boardroom meetings, no profit reports, no corporate calls. Just him, walking the aisles like anyone else, blending into the crowd. Dressed in a simple navy polo and a pair of jeans, James looked like an average shopper. His dark blonde hair was slightly messy, his reading glasses perched comfortably on the bridge of his nose. No one gave him a second glance. To the employees, he was just another face in the store. And that's exactly what he wanted. That was exactly what he wanted. Staying anonymous would allow him to see things as they really were, without the polished performance employees put on when they knew the boss was watching. James moved through the aisles at a steady pace, blending in with the afternoon crowd. The produce section was neatly arranged, the dairy shelves were well-stocked, and the canned goods were lined up in perfect rows. Everything looked good on the surface. The store was clean, efficient, just as it should be. Yet, something felt off. The employees were doing their jobs, but there was no real energy behind it. They smiled occasionally, but it was the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. Their movements were practiced, their words scripted. At one of the checkout counters, a young cashier greeted a customer with a half-hearted, "Hi, how are you?" His eyes barely lifted from the register as he scanned the items in a rapid, mechanical rhythm. "That'll be $40.50, he said flatly, already moving on to the next transaction before the customer had even pulled out their card. It was efficient, but it was impersonal. As James observed, a question gnawed at him: was this what his stores had become? A place where employees just followed a script, where interactions were nothing more than necessary transactions. Was this the culture he had unknowingly built? He continued walking, his gaze drifting to the other registers. A young man in his early 20s was scanning groceries with robotic precision, his fingers moving quickly over the buttons, his eyes never leaving the screen. A few lanes over, an older woman, probably in her mid-50s, seemed far more interested in chatting with a co-worker than in helping the next customer in line. James exhaled quietly, making a mental note, and then he saw her, Jasmine Carter, at the far end of the checkout lanes. She stood out not because of her looks, but because of her presence. Mid-20s, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile, she had a way of making people feel seen. James watched as she interacted with each customer, her voice light, her tone inviting. She made eye contact, she listened, and every so often, she cracked a joke that had the person in front of her chuckling as they packed their groceries. She wasn't just doing the job, she was connecting. James moved closer, keeping his expression neutral, still trying to blend in. But already, he had the feeling that Jasmine was about to teach him something he hadn't realized he needed to learn. James wasn't sure what he was looking for yet. Maybe it was just curiosity. Or maybe he needed to confirm what he had been dreading all along. The line moved slower than he had expected. A few customers behind him shifted impatiently, tapping their fingers against their carts, exhaling sharply. But Jasmine never wavered. Every interaction, no matter how routine, had her full attention. She asked about people's day and actually listened to the answer. She noticed when someone looked tired or frustrated. When an elderly woman struggled to lift a heavy bag of groceries, Jasmine didn't hesitate. She stepped around the counter and helped without being asked. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was rare. And to James, that made all the difference. As he stepped forward in line, he found himself studying her with quiet admiration. She didn't just work here, she embodied service. Finally, it was his turn. The line behind him had grown even longer, but Jasmine remained completely present. She wasn't looking over his shoulder, wasn't rushing to get through the next transaction. She met his gaze with a warm smile. "Hi there, how's your day going?" Her tone wasn't forced. It wasn't the automatic, empty greeting he had heard from so many others. It was real, and for the first time that afternoon, James found himself smiling back. But something about this moment made him pause. Would she have done things differently than the others? Was this really just a job to her, or was there something more? The line continued to grow behind him, carts piled high with groceries. He could feel the quiet tension in the air, customers checking their watches, shifting impatiently, silently urging the line to move faster. Yet Jasmine remained unfazed. She moved with a steady rhythm, scanning each item with the same calm, methodical ease. Beep, another item. Beep, another smile. There was no panic in her posture, no rushed movements. She was in control. James stood there, taking it all in. The contrast between her and the other employees was undeniable. Further down the row of registers, another cashier rang up groceries without looking up, her hands moving robotically across the screen. A woman at a different lane barely acknowledged an elderly customer in front of her, more interested in chatting with her co-worker than making sure the woman had everything she needed. The difference was clear. Jasmine wasn't just doing a job. She was making a difference. A few registers down, another cashier barely glanced up from the screen, muttering a half-hearted, "Hey," as a young father with a restless toddler hurried through the line. It was fast. It was efficient. But it wasn't real. It wasn't personal. Jasmine, on the other hand, seemed to understand something that the others didn't, that these transactions weren't just about exchanging money for groceries. They were about people, a small gesture, a few kind words, an acknowledgement of someone's presence. Sometimes that was all it took to make a difference. And the customers ahead of James recognized it too. They lingered for a moment longer, smiled a little wider, responded to her warmth with genuine engagement. A quick joke, a shared laugh. Jasmine was making an impact in a way that was almost imperceptible, yet deeply felt. But why hadn't anyone else picked up on it? James couldn't shake the thought. Were the other cashiers simply indifferent? Or had no one ever taught them how to connect with people beyond the mechanics of the job? Were they like the employees he had observed earlier, just checking off boxes, moving through their shifts like clockwork, without stopping to think about what their work really meant? His mind churned with questions. What was missing here? Why did it seem so obvious with Jasmine but invisible to everyone else? Then movement caught his eye. A man in front of him, a scruffy-looking guy in a faded baseball cap, shifted restlessly at the counter. His fingers drummed against the conveyor belt, his jaw clenched. Every second that passed seemed to irritate him more. James recognized the signs immediately: the impatient glances, the exasperated sighs, the subtle tension in his stance. Jasmine noticed too. She didn't tense. She didn't rush. Instead, she took a slow, steady breath and looked up at him with the same calm expression she had given every other customer. "Looks like you've got a lot on your plate today," she said, her voice light but composed. "Anything I can do to make this a little quicker for you?" The man paused, his narrowed eyes flicked up to hers. For a moment, James thought he was going to snap at her, but then something shifted, a short laugh. Barely there, but unmistakable. "Yeah. Sorry," the man exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just a long day," Jasmine nodded, still unshaken. "I hear you. One of those days, huh?" She didn't pry, didn't force a conversation, just a simple, understanding response. But it was enough. The man's shoulders loosened. The frustration in his posture melted, just a little. Jasmine finished bagging his groceries, handed them over with a smile, and wished him a good rest of his day. And just like that, the entire interaction had changed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. James watched him walk away, his steps a little lighter than before. And as he turned back to Jasmine, another thought pressed at the edges of his mind. What was it about her? Was it just her personality? Or was there something deeper at play? James thought back to his earlier observations, the cashiers who moved like machines, their interactions cold and distant. Now, the difference was obvious. Jasmine wasn't just scanning items, she was connecting with people. Her kindness wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't scripted. It wasn't part of some customer service handbook or a corporate checklist. It was real. It came from within. But was that enough to change James's perspective on everything he thought he knew? Or was he just overanalyzing a simple moment? His turn was next, but his mind was still tangled with questions. Why did the other employees seem so disengaged? Was it burnout, a lack of motivation, or something deeper? Jasmine, on the other hand, radiated an energy that was impossible to ignore. Warmth, presence, a genuine care for the people standing in front of her. And in that moment, a realization hit him like a wave. He had spent years obsessed with profit margins, growth and expansion, measuring success in numbers, percentages, and sales reports. But what if he had been looking at it all wrong? What if the real key to success had nothing to do with spreadsheets but everything to do with people? With the way they felt in his stores, with the culture he had unknowingly built. Jasmine pulled him from his thoughts with a bright, effortless greeting. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying none of the monotony he had heard from the others. Her smile was steady, warm, unwavering. For the first time that afternoon, James felt something unexpected. Not just admiration, but something deeper, a reckoning. For a brief moment, he almost forgot he was just another customer in line. He was simply a person talking to someone who cared. A small, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Hello." His own voice sounded foreign to him, almost awkward in comparison to her effortless ease. He shifted slightly, suddenly aware of himself in a way he hadn't been before. Maybe business wasn't just about supermarkets. Maybe it wasn't even about transactions. Maybe it was about the people. Jasmine continued scanning his items, packing them with the same careful attention she had given to every customer before him. "Busy as usual," she said, glancing up at him with an easy grin. But I like it that way. The way she said it, it wasn't just small talk. It was an invitation, a chance for him to see what she saw. And James wasn't sure if he was ready for what that meant. "You know how it is," Jasmine said with an easy shrug. "People need their essentials." "Yeah, I suppose so," James replied, his tone lighter now, more at ease. As he watched her work, he noticed something that had been eluding him all day. There was an effortlessness to her, a natural authenticity that made it impossible for him to stay lost in his thoughts. She rang up his last item, and James suddenly realized how much time had passed. He hadn't even noticed the line behind him growing longer. Jasmine finished bagging his groceries, and he hesitated. There was something inside him, an urge to ask more, to dig deeper than the usual surface-level exchange between customer and cashier. But how? How could he, without it feeling off? Before he could think better of it, the words tumbled out. "Are you always like this?" As soon as he said it, he felt ridiculous. Too curious, too eager, too invested. But the question was already out there. And Jasmine, she didn't miss a beat. She just smiled. "I try to be," she said simply. "People come in here carrying a lot. It's not just about selling groceries. It's about making sure they feel seen, you know. You'd be surprised how much people just want to be acknowledged." James blinked, letting her words settle. A part of him had always known that business wasn't just about numbers and sales, but it was easy to forget. He had spent years chasing growth, optimizing efficiency, pushing for bigger margins, never stopping to think about the human side of it all. Jasmine, however, seemed to understand something he didn't. It wasn't about the products. It wasn't about the stock. It wasn't even about the profits. It was about the people. For a moment, James said nothing. The simplicity of it almost frustrated him. How had he missed something so obvious? Yet, as the moments stretched between them, he found himself standing at a crossroads. Would he leave it at that, or would he push further? The store hummed around them, beeping scanners, murmured conversations, the distant clatter of carts against polished tile. Jasmine finished tying off his last bag. The line behind him was still growing, and yet he hesitated. There was something about her, something about the way she carried herself, the way she saw her work that James needed to understand. For the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar tugging at him. An odd mix of guilt and inspiration. He swallowed, then spoke, his voice quieter now, but no less intent. "Jasmine," he started, choosing his words carefully. "Do you ever get frustrated?" A flicker of curiosity crossed her face. "With what?" he exhaled, glancing around the store. "With how things are here, with how the job is treated." For just a second, Jasmine's smile faltered. She didn't answer right away. James could see the wheels turning in her mind, the way she carefully considered her words before speaking. Finally, she said, "It's not the job itself. It's how people see it." The words hit harder than he expected. James had anticipated frustration, maybe even resentment. He had asked a question that, in his experience, often led to complaints about low wages, long hours, or difficult customers. But Jasmine's response, it was different. It was honest. It wasn't clouded by bitterness or disillusionment. She had found a way to take a job that most people dismissed as a dead end and turn it into something meaningful. She wasn't just doing the work, she was living a philosophy. James nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. What made a company successful? Not just numbers. Not just expansion. The people, employees like Jasmine, they were the foundation. The driving force, the heart of everything. Jasmine paused, her eyes flickering with thought. "I get it. It's not easy," she admitted. "But it's the little things that matter. You just have to find the right balance." James studied her for a moment, struck by how much wisdom she carried for someone so young. There was something raw and undeniably real in her words, something that made him feel like he had been walking around with his eyes closed for years. "I thought I knew how my employees were doing," he confessed, his voice quieter now. "I didn't expect to see all this." He gestured around the store, not at the shelves, the aisles, or the registers, but at the energy of it all, the unspoken dynamics, the human connection he had ignored for so long. He had been too focused on the wrong things for too long. Jasmine's smile returned gentler this time, as if she understood something he hadn't even said. "Well, I'm glad you saw something good." She let out a small laugh. "Honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect either. But it's nice to know that someone notices." James felt something shift inside him. Something important, something he couldn't ignore anymore. He took a deep breath, clarity settling over him like a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. But he knew this moment was just the beginning. The real question was, what was he going to do with it? As he stood there, feeling the magnitude of what he had just learned, one thing became painfully clear. He couldn't go back to seeing things the way he had before. It felt like the entire conversation had been a mirror reflecting back everything James had been neglecting in his business, everything he had taken for granted. He glanced around. Her attitude, her ability to see people as more than transactions, that had made all the difference. Jasmine hadn't waited for permission to change the way she treated customers. She just did it, and the effect was undeniable. James leaned against the counter, his thoughts racing in every direction. How many of his employees were like Jasmine, but too afraid to show it? How many had he overlooked simply because they didn't fit the corporate mold he had created? How many had become disheartened, and then he realized something. Change didn't have to come from a massive corporate overhaul. It didn't require a huge budget. It didn't need months of restructuring. It could start with something much simpler, a shift in mindset. A change in how he approached his employees, how he valued them. James straightened, a decision forming in his mind. He could change the culture of his company. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. All it would take was showing his employees that they mattered. Jasmine studied him for a moment, then smiled just slightly. "But enough, that would be amazing," she said. "But you can't just talk about it, you have to show it. People can tell when something's real." James nodded. She was right. He could start small, one store at a time. He could implement a training program that prioritized connection over efficiency. He could encourage managers to know their employees not just as workers, but as people. "Thank you, Jasmine," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity he hadn't expected. She tilted her head. "For what?" "For everything," she laughed. "I didn't do anything, you did more than you know." Jasmine shrugged, a small smirk playing on her lips. "Well, then, what can I do to help?" James smiled. "Nothing," he said. "Just keep doing what you're doing." As he stood there, the weight of his decision settling over him, James realized something. Jasmine hadn't just given him insight into customer service. She had shown him how to be a better leader, how to connect with people not just as a business owner, not just as a boss, as a human being. She had reminded him that success wasn't just about profits, it was about relationships. About people, about making every interaction count. But now the real work began, simple but profound. The work ahead wouldn't be easy. It would require a shift not just in the way James viewed his employees, but in the way he saw himself as a leader. But it was a shift he was willing to make. He didn't waste time. The very next morning, he called a series of meetings with his senior management team. He laid everything out: what he had witnessed in the store, what he had learned from Jasmine, and the realization that had shaken him to his core. The company had become too focused on growth and efficiency. And in doing so, they had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered. The people. James knew he couldn't just tell them. He had to show them. So over the next few weeks, he put his ideas into action. He started by visiting his stores in person just as he had done that fateful afternoon. But this time, he wasn't lurking in the background, watching from a distance. He was engaging. He talked to employees. He listened to their stories. He asked about their experiences, their challenges, their thoughts on what could be better. And just like Jasmine had done, he treated them as people, not just workers. At first, the employees were caught off guard. They had never seen James this involved, this hands-on. But slowly, something began to shift. Employees started to open up. They shared their frustrations, their ideas, their hopes. And James, he listened. The company's culture didn't change overnight. But it started to shift, not because of a memo, not because of new policies, but because, for the first time in a long time, employees felt valued. The shift wasn't just about customer service anymore. It was about creating a culture of respect, trust, and human connection. James wasn't perfect. He had moments where he slipped back into old habits, where he focused too much on the numbers, too little on the people. But every time, he reminded himself of the bigger picture. What Jasmine had taught him, what he had seen with his own eyes. And as the months passed, something incredible happened. His stores didn't just become better places to work. They became better places to shop. Customers noticed the shift. They noticed employees smiling more, engaging more, caring more. They felt the difference. Because, in the end, it had never been just about selling products. It had always been about people. And finally, James understood that. One day, James walked into the supermarket again. Jasmine was at her register, scanning groceries with that same quiet warmth. She looked up, surprised. "You again?" she asked, clearly not expecting to see him. James smiled. "I'm here to thank you." Jasmine blinked. "For what?" "For reminding me what really matters." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. I don't know what to say." "I was just doing my job," James chuckled. "You were doing more than that. You showed me something I had forgotten. A business isn't just about customers, it's about employees. It's about people, the small things. The kindness, the connection, that's what makes all the difference." Jasmine studied him for a moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. James let out a slow breath, feeling an unexpected sense of gratitude settle over him. He knew the work wasn't over. The road ahead would have its challenges, but he wasn't focused on the numbers anymore. He was focused on the people. Their stories, their needs, their humanity. And for the first time in a long while, James Callahan felt truly fulfilled in his role as a leader. But as he walked out of the store that day, he knew something else, too. Leadership isn't a destination, it's a process. A continuous journey of learning, growing, and showing up, not just as an owner, but as someone who truly cares. And with each visit, James saw the difference. The employees who once seemed disconnected were now engaged, eager to make the shopping experience better for every customer. The customers felt it too. The atmosphere was warmer. The service was more attentive, and for the first time in a long time, the store felt like more than just a place to buy groceries. But the real power of this change, it wasn't in big, sweeping policies. It was in the small moments, the little things that had once been overlooked. The smiles, the genuine interactions. Because that's where businesses truly thrive, not in the numbers, but in the way people feel when they walk through the door. So as you take in this story, think about your own life. Think about the moments when a simple act of kindness made all the difference. Think about the people you see every day, the cashier at the grocery store, the barista who makes your coffee, the colleague sitting just a few feet away. And ask yourself, how can you make them feel seen, heard, valued? Because sometimes the smallest actions, a smile, a kind word, a moment of genuine connection, can change the course of someone's day, maybe even their life. We all have the power to make a difference. And maybe right now someone out there needs to hear it. So take a moment today, make someone feel valued. Because when you show up with your whole heart, you never know who you might change along the way.